I'm always very excited when I get to talk to founders about co-founding team, because I think there's a lot of topics that you guys already covered and addressed, but there is the one which is actually quite important and very often doesn't get a lot of attention. So well done on putting it actually on your agenda. And let's us just start with a little bit of teaser and speaking about co-founding, and then based on my understanding, Simon, there will be a time for us to ask questions and go to the individual interests of the group and participants. So let me see if this works. It does work. Just a very brief introduction. Who am I and why am I actually talking to you about co-founding? So my name is Jana Nevrlka. I have a business and a legal background, and I think more interestingly, I have myself an entrepreneurial experience. I had one startup which I reasonably succeeded because I took it over, grew it, and sold it. And I have one startup that absolutely horrifically failed, and that failure was because of the co-founding team. As you might guess, that was for me the whole beginning into the co-founding topic and journey. It's about 10 years back. And it started with my failed startup and us actually asking the question, okay, I have a legal business background, I have 20 years of business experience. How come we didn't get this right? And that's when I discovered some of the numbers behind how many times does it actually happen that startups do not succeed because of co-founding teams, and decided with my humble contribution to actually help founders to close that gap. Since then, I worked with probably 1,000+ founding teams and summarized the experience in the book Co-Founding the Right Way, where it's more details about it. And my mission is to help founders build successful co-founding teams. But let us start with a question, and for as much as it's possible, whether in the chat or virtually, let's participate. How many do you think of today's top 10 most valuable companies, if we measure it by market capitalization, were co-founded versus solo founded? I don't know if it's technically possible for anyone to volunteer with an answer. So for much as possible, hands up. Who does think that most companies, successful, most valuable companies were solo founded?
So a question for the audience.
Sorry?
Or solo founded? What do you think these top companies were? Multiple founders or a single founder? Multiple founders, everyone's saying.
All right, very, very clever audience. I can hear that. I cannot see you, but I can hear that. Absolutely, right? So this is something that I'm actually following for over 5 years now. Previously, the proportion would be 7-3. Last year, we moved to 8-2. But it seems like majority of the most valuable world's companies were actually co-founded versus solo founded, right? So that is, that is correct. And it seems that co-founding is a good idea for many reasons, right? Most of you might already thought about it or know it, right? 1 + 1 can be more than 2. You're sharing risk, you have combined motivation, and you have combined perseverance, right? Which, especially on the entrepreneur's journey, these things are not to underestimate, because being an entrepreneur is one of the most rewarding, but also one of the hardest career choices that you can make. So you have combined. Last but not least, it is also preferred by investors, right? So that is the sunny side. I think here we have a very successful co-founder story. For those of you who recognize Larry and Sergey, Google founders, I think in their over 30 years of co-founding story, the only known co-founding dispute was over an extramarital affair with one of the employees that one of the founders had. Other than that, beautiful example, successful co-founding, good story. But then we also have the shady side, right? The dark side of the co-founding stories. Again, I'm choosing a very notorious example. We have the Facebook co-founder story of Mark Zuckerberg and Eduardo Severin, multiple court cases, dilution of a shareholder, very bitter feelings, or the 2 Steves of Apple. Also not such a happy co-founder story. But what I would actually want to stress that these cases are big exemption, Because here we have a co-founder war stories about which we know. But unfortunately, much more companies where the co-founders did not agree, we will never hear about because the companies never made it, never survived. And let me start before we get on the positive side, how to make it right. But let me start with some numbers, which are perhaps not something that you might expect it, but it's something very important for you to keep in mind as you embark on your co-founding journey. So based on one of the, I guess, most long-term and in terms of data points, most detailed startup studies, which was performed by Professor Noam Wasserman, back then Harvard Business School professor, and the study was published in his book called Founder Dilemma. Up to 60% of startup failures are contributed to co-founding team issues, right? I don't know whether the number could be taken as a hard number. That number is very much, for me, it was corroborated whenever I would talk to serial entrepreneurs or startup investors. 2/3 success or failure would come down to the co-founding team, right? And it's something that is very seldomly actually really talked about and addressed. So what is actually going on here, right? Because on one side we hear, okay, co-founding is fantastic. You know, most valuable companies are created by co-founding teams. But on the other hand, we have these scary numbers of 2/3 of startups potentially not making it because of co-founders. So what is exactly happening here? And I just want to give you super oversimplified generalizations. But in the beginning, entrepreneurs tend to have a lot of thin glasses, right? So either we are friends or we are colleagues, we know each other, or we just met on the startup weekend, but we are perfect fit, we're excited, everything is going to work fine, we'll all become rich, we just split evenly, we don't have a lot of time to waste on this whole co-founding business, and we allocate equity equally and let's just move on, right? Later on, what might happen in this scenario will be, well, but I actually did more work than you do, or I'm doing more work than you do because you are part-time, I'm full-time, I'm bringing more expertise, I brought the investors, I put up the money, I actually want to leave the business and I want to sell my share. All the possible scenarios that are listed there, trust me, I've talked to the founders who actually unfortunately happen to be there. And it's very difficult to resolve these things when you never talked about it before, because a lot of that comes down to actually not being prepared. And what are the costs of failure? They are relatively high. There will be the failed businesses, there might be the damaged relationships, and worst of all, discouraged entrepreneurs. During the day, I was giving a workshop where there were 3 founders who said, I'm actually going solo and I'm never ever going to co-found with the co-founders because my previous experience was so bad, right? Now, I hope that all of you who are actually participating in the Founders Festival will never have to say anything like that, because what you will do, you will co-found in the right way. And what is the right way? I don't think we can ever speak about universal formulas or, like you need to have 3 co-founders or you need to have this diversity or you need to allocate the equity or in this or that way. But what I think is the right way is to actually appreciate that this is one of the most important things that you as a founder are building for your company. And then finding out what are the tools and what is the knowledge that you can actually apply to this topic. Because I don't know how many of us would consider something like, I don't know, jumping from a plane with a parachute without ever learning how to do it correctly. But somehow, interestingly, a lot of us attempt to do the same thing when we are founding our first business and we get co-founders on and we think, okay, we'll just figure it out as we go. And then some of us might be surprised that, well, actually things didn't go as well as planned. And why I'm emphasizing the first time aspect is because if I may share with you, in my work, I would think that 95% of the founders that I work with individually one-on-one would be serial entrepreneurs, would be the entrepreneurs who went on the journey, had an experience that if you don't address it, things might backfire or slow you down. So they appreciate how important the co-founding team is. And only 5% of the entrepreneurs would be the first-time entrepreneurs because they think, how difficult can it be? You just get the right people, you get the right competencies, you set up a team and you go. And why I'm stressing it is that for those of you who are actually doing it the first time, I would just hope and wish that the experience of, okay, this thing actually requires my attention and requires to do this in a way that is structured and I don't commit the usual mistake, is actually something which is really worth it doing. Now, what is the right way? Unfortunately, in the short time that we have, we cannot go through all the steps that I would recommend, but what I would like to suggest is to follow a relatively structured process, which sometimes might help when it comes to such a, in a way, fuzzy subject like people relationships or setup of a team, and then more quantitative aspect as allocation of an equity. But what I did with the 7 steps of co-founding is I pretty much reverse engineered of categorized most of the mistakes that I've heard entrepreneurs committed, where the teams went wrong, and how would you go about it if you wanted to prevent it. And out of that came out a process that I would recommend each and every founder to follow. To first answer for yourself a question if co-founding is the right choice for you. Because as much as we can say for majority of the most valuable companies it's not for everybody. So there are qualification criteria. Is co-founding actually the right choice for you? Second thing would be to actually know what you are looking for, which type of business you are building, which type of complementary skills or diversity do you require to build that business, and give that a very careful thought. Third part would be pre-selecting your co-founders. What do you want your co-founders to bring? And there the criteria, what is the difference between first employees and between co-founders, right? Co-founders being actually people who will have the skin in the game, who will have the longer term commitment as opposed to one-time gig at the beginning, and people who bring essential skills and resources to your business. Fourth, and perhaps the most important steps, date your co-founders. The same way, very few of us would actually consider getting married when you go on the first date. Have you spent enough time knowing your co-founders? For those of you who consider founding with family or friends, right? Very often we assume we actually know people coming from these circles, but do you actually know them as potential co-founders, right? Because it might be very different doing a barbecue with someone every Sunday and having the pressure of having a startup business. So do you know these people? Do you know how they react when they are under pressure? Do you know what their absolute value ethical no-goes are, right? Because that could show up when which type of investors would you get or which type of customers would you accept. So spending enough time of dating your co-founders, potential co-founders, and not committing in terms of equity, in terms of long-term perspective, not committing until you are sure that you actually found the right people. Step 5 would be getting what I call getting serious, is to get very specific on what type of contributions are the people bringing to your business, right? What will be the potential roles? How are you going to set up the team? There also belongs what is the commitment, right? Are you able in your team to accommodate part-time co-founders, or do you only require a full-time commitment? And if you are having combination or full-time and part-time co-founders, how are you going to reflect it in step number 6, which is the equity allocation? And here, I think I come to one of the things that I would like you to take away, probably one of the most important things. The whole topic of equity allocation and how you set up the team should only come once all the previous things are clear and discussed. So you have the right people, you know what their contribution, what their role on the team is, you know what their long-term commitment is, and only then it actually makes sense what would be the fair equity allocation within the team. the whole topic of fairness and how to make your equity allocation motivational but also sustainable, so if there are changes in the future, how that initial equity allocation can respond to it, is another very juicy and wealthy topic. And I would just invite you as founders to realize to learn that there are more choices than just fixed equity allocation in the beginning. There are vesting schemes, there are dynamic equity allocation options. Make sure that you inform yourself at least about some of them and then make the right choice for your team. And next to equity allocation, please also think what might happen if any of your co-founders leave, which is called the equity recovery side, right? One thing is to give it out, and the other thing is life changes. One of your co-founders needs to leave. What happens, how to protect both the co-founders and the company against too much debt equity in the early stages. And step number 7, and here is where comes my legal hat on. Once you make that agreement, clear agreement, transparent understanding with your co-founders, make sure that you actually document it in a way which is transparent, signed, potentially enforceable, and it's for the benefit of everyone to actually have it documented and have it clear and signed. So those would be the steps to actually recommend. There is much more detail behind it. There are tools for each step. But I think what is helpful to know that there is potentially a structured process that might help you to go through it. And the emphasis on it is actually worth to spend time on doing through it. Some of the typical mistakes that happens if you don't would be ending up with a suboptimal co-founding team, meaning you might have people that are actually not suitable for the business you are building, or you might have allocated too much or having not the fair equity split. So you might have allocated the equity between the co-founders, not really reflecting their long-term contributions. And in case that happens, that has a very big impact, of course, on the performance of the co-founding team. Because if you are a co-founder who thinks, okay, I'm not getting my fair share, long-term, you either leave or you underperform. In either case, it's not an ideal situation to actually have on the team. Or not having clear commitment and roles of the co-founders, right? Those would be in the category of the typical mistakes to avoid. The missed opportunity out of that is not coming as far as you possibly could with your startup, not getting the chance for external financing to scale, and last, but I would say definitely not least, not having as much fun on the co-founding journey as you possibly can. Now, even though I now actually said, okay, it's risky and there are things and you need to be aware, I would still be a very strong advocate of the result of the whole co-founding question and consideration. I think it's the best summarized by apparently an unknown African proverb. Do you want to go fast? Go alone. Do you want to go far? Go together. So it makes sense. Having co-founders and the right co-founding team can be a huge differentiating success in your business. What it needs an attention in how you structure it and how you set it up. And it's not always intuitive and it's not always easy to do it that way. So thank you very much for your attention. Now we had the teaser, and now I don't know, Simon, if you would like to, or how we structure it, and we can dive in the questions.
Jana, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's brilliant. That's really, really good. Could the online audience please put any questions in the chats? That's much easier, and then Jana can pick up there. Before I go to any questions here in London, we're going to be running, I'm going to talk about this a bit later, but we're going to be running a startup hackathon. And one of the things that we're doing with that, we're launching a whole group of businesses with an awful lot of people contributing, mentors and different co-founders. And one of the ways we're going to approach the equity side of things is something I know we both talked about, is dynamic equity and something called slicing pie. If we don't get too many questions, I'd love you to just very briefly elaborate on what dynamic equity is and why it's a much fairer system in the early stage before you know each other. But I think first of all, I'll see if there are any questions in the audience. Any questions? Question in the audience? I'm just going to give the microphone.
So I'll just write it down so we make sure we have all of them. Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, it's quite linked to what Simon was just mentioning. In terms of, the start of having a conversation with a potential co-founder around the equity, once you go through those stages, what are some of the factors or considerations in terms of what that equity split should look like? Particularly if you are maybe joining something where the other person has already built the product.
Sorry, would you mind repeating the last part of the question? I have a little bit difficulties. I had a little bit of what are the part of the consideration around the equity split conversation with your founder, and what was the last bit about the technical bill, please?
The part of it was particularly if they have already built a product and you're coming on board once something's already been built.
Right. So you would have a later joining potential co-founders while part of the business was already done and achieved. And okay, so if I may, to actually answer Simon's question, because it would be leading to what is potentially a suitable answer for this type of conversations and this type of situation, right? So let me plug this in and see if you can actually, if I will be better. So what is the main challenge of you as founder when it comes to the equity split as we have it now is that you are asked to allocate the equity of your company in relatively early stages when you incorporate the business, right? Which might have reflected the reality of starting a local bakery, 50 years ago, and you did it with your uncle and, you were in it for life. Nowadays, when we start companies and you first have a technical phase, then you onboard people, then you pivot and you change co-founders. This is a very tricky situation because you need to decide in the early stage of the company, and if something changes later on, you have relatively few options how to adjust it or how to do this. How are you going to reflect, for example, the situation like that fairly? Now, in reaction to that was developed what is called the dynamic equity split. And the most well-known, as Simon pointed out, is called slicing pie. And what that alternative equity allocation method provides actually says, look, if we do a fixed equity split, we very frequently end up with unfair equity split. And that's not because founders want to take benefits or advantage of the others or because we want to be unfair, but simply because at the moment when we are asked to allocate the equity, the situation looks X, and half a year or a year later, when the company still is fundraising and not fully profitable, so that means the founder's time is still at risk, the situation changes, right? Now, how do you have a way how to change your equity split? Because there are underlying philosophies. Either you say, okay, we allocate the equity equally and we don't care who contributes what. And there are cultures in which this works fantastic. Like, for example, Asia or in the Nordics, founders actually work like that. It works for them. But then there are founding cultures or philosophies where you think, okay, somehow the equity should be proportionate to the founders' contributions and to the risk that the founders take. Now, and if the second one is your underlying philosophy, you need to have something that enables you to allocate the equity as per the contributions. And if you need to choose too early on or at certain stage, and then that changes because you need to onboard a new co-founder, your hands are tied. Alternative to that is, and in UK, for example, is perfectly legally possible to implement the dynamic equity split as well. So alternative to that is to say, look, we actually don't know what the future will look like, and we are aware of not knowing it. So what we will do, we will measure founders' contributions over a period of X time. And based on who actually contributed to the business, we will at some point freeze the pie and allocate the equity based on real contributions, not what we thought it's going to be. If this model is particularly suitable, if you have different time periods that the founders committed, different commitments, so the whole part-time, full-time situation, or late joiners or people leaving. So for that particular type of discussion, I would actually check this methodology and see if you can actually, if this would be helpful for this conversation. If you would like to find out more about it, just go Mike Moyer Slicing Pie and check it out there, because that would be very suitable, I would think, especially in this situation.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful, and I think we'll put that in the chat as well. The next talk is going to start in a second, but if you could just take one of the questions from the chat very, very briefly while we're just getting ready for the next talk.
So at one point, should a non-tech solo entrepreneur look for a technical co-founder? I would say always driven by the needs of the business. So it depends. If you have the resources and you can purchase technical skills to help you continue on your pathway, postpone. If you find the right person with the right skills and it's the right time in the business, onboard them. So it's very difficult to answer without the context, right? But partially getting co-founder for the sweat equity is also a possibility to get the resources. Do I have time for one more question, Simon?
Yes, yeah, quick one, Jana, and then we're going to switch. One.
Okay. So can I divide responsibilities as follows? I take care of the creative research and my co-founder takes care of the financial and commercial. Yeah, why not? What is super important is that whatever division of responsibilities, that there is sufficient clarity and not an overlap. Because if you have an overlap, you end up with difficulties of decision making, but you also end up with some things not being done at all and some things being done double. So it can go across what we know are the traditional roles, but sufficient clarity for you and potentially the team that you hire to actually operate in that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. We've got to sort of get ready for the next talk, but there's a lot of questions both in the chat, and I can see people with their hands up in the audience.
Please, for the hands up in the audience, Simon, if I just may, please type the questions and I'll just try to answer it in the chat as we go. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, big round of applause for Jana.